Welcome back to another edition of K-Pan Today. It is Wednesday, August 26th, and Heather had a great conversation with State Senator Bruce Tarr.
Yes, we talked about the election. No one's ever seen an election like this in Massachusetts with so much early voting and mail-in ballots. And the senator pointed out that you have to be careful when you've never done something before. So, Senator Tarr, what kind of confidence do you have in this election?
You know, like any situation where you're trying something new, obviously we have to be concerned about the integrity of the process and we have to be very careful about it. And we've seen some reasons to be concerned in terms of ballots that haven't necessarily made it to where they should be making it to. And on Cape Ann, we've had some particular concern with regard to a situation in Gloucester where some request for ballot information came with a return address in Watertown. And we've been trying to track that down to make sure that people are actually mailing their request for a ballot to the city clerk in Gloucester so that they can get a ballot. And so this is the kind of troubleshooting that I think we're going to have to do, Heather, but it's a question of trade-offs. And obviously, there's been concern about having everyone vote in person and what that might do with regard to public health. But at the same time, we absolutely must have elections, and we must have elections on the dates that they are ordained to be on. And so trying to strike that balance has been a bit of a challenge. The reason that I have faith is because of our clerks. In conversations with them, they've indicated to me that they think there are safeguards in place to make sure that, notwithstanding errors that might occur with regard to mailings and where things went, that they can ensure that only one vote is being cast by one person. And that is absolutely critical. And it's something that my office has been in touch with the clerks about and the Secretary of State's office. So I acknowledge that there are going to be some issues here that we're going to have to address. But in the long run, I think we can have confidence in the system to work as it always has. We need to make sure that we can absolutely verify that eligible voters are getting the ability to request a ballot. And when they do request a ballot, they get the ballot that they've requested. So the trail of accountability here is very important. And one of the complicating factors is the volume. We're hearing from the clerks a lot of volume in requests for remote voting for mail-in ballots. And so the system in the past has not been designed to handle that much volume. It's generally dealt with absentee ballots, which are a much smaller percentage than what we think we're going to see. So it is a new approach, and we are going to have to watch it very carefully. And I would point out, Heather, as we're talking about this, we're talking about on the week of the anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. So cutting edge legislation at the time to be able to enfranchise everyone with the ability to vote. And it's still just as important to give everyone the ability to vote. And yet we're dealing with a new set of circumstances that are going to create a challenge that we absolutely must respond to.
And as I understand, the Secretary of State, Bill Galvin, had some thoughts about mail-in voting. He was suggesting that people hand deliver them.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's important for people to understand is if you request a ballot, it doesn't mean that you still can't bring it directly to the clerk in the municipality. It also doesn't mean that you can't go on the date of on election day or in early voting to bring that ballot then as well. So when you have the ballot in hand, it doesn't mean that it absolutely has to be put back in the mail to go back. And that's something that we're trying to make sure everyone understands and gets clarity about.
And there are a number of drop boxes that are open 24 hours a day where people can. And I know one is on the back of City Hall in Gloucester. Rockport has a drop box where you can drop off your ballot there directly into the system.
Absolutely. And when you do that, you can feel confident because it's going directly to the clerk. And so those drop boxes are a very important tool.
And what about poll workers?
So one of the things that we did in the legislature before August was to pass a bill that allowed a lot of the mail-in voting, but also allowed some ease on the restrictions relative to having poll workers. So for instance, we know that usually when we go to vote, we deal with two sets of poll workers, one that checks us in and one that checks us out after we've deposited or as we're depositing our ballot in the ballot box. That legislation allows a community, if it so chooses, to only have the first part of that so that you deal with folks who check you in, but not necessarily the folks that check you out. And the reason for that was concern that there might not be enough poll workers to be able to manage the situation. And similarly, there was also relief that was granted relative to the election workers themselves and being able to have some flexibility about who can be a poll worker and also who can be an official at the polls. And so we granted a lot of flexibility because the concern then, and I don't think that concern has changed now, is that we may not have the number of people that we usually have, and we may not have the number of people that we need. So the legislature granted flexibility. The governor signed the bill to be able to allow some leeway in executing the process because, again, we're dealing with uncharted waters. We don't know what we're going to experience. We certainly are trying to make more use of early voting to be able to take some of the pressure off of Election Day, but we still don't know what we're going to encounter.
And there is an active effort on the part of the Secretary of State to recruit poll workers, right?
Absolutely. It's a situation that comes from a couple of different directions, but one of them is that oftentimes the people that work at polls are retirees, and they tend to be a little bit older and thus might be in the higher risk category for contracting COVID-19. And so being able to start early and try to recruit people that want to help is very important, but at the same time, we need to make sure that everyone who's working at the polls is qualified to do so and is closely monitored, particularly if they're new folks, because again, what's at stake is the integrity of our electoral process, and that is critical to our democracy.
So all these things cost money, Senator Tarr, and as I understand it, towns are having to put this money up front to train poll workers, to put in that extra time, to all the extra hours to process the ballots. What will happen going forward with these costs?
Well, my hope is that we are going to absorb those costs as state government to the greatest extent we possibly can to help the cities and towns. I have, over the last several years, been trying to pass legislation that makes it a statutory requirement for early voting that the Commonwealth picks up the costs associated with that. And I feel no differently about this situation, that we need to do as much as we can to help cities and towns that'll have their clerk's offices overwhelmed with expenditures that they never had to make before. And hopefully we'll be able to do that. And I think there's a lot of support for that idea in the legislature as we move forward. And one thing that's very interesting to note is that our state auditor, Suzanne Bump, has been watching these electoral processes very carefully to determine whether or not some of the things that have been mandated by the state constitute unfunded mandates. Because, of course, if they do, we should be compelled to act to be able to ensure that they are no longer unfunded, even though they'll still be mandates. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here. And again, as we've talked about already in the conversation, Heather, we need to understand what is happening and be able to take the measure of it so that we can respond financially. Right now, that's a little bit more difficult to do because we've never been down this road before. So as we go down the road, we need to document costs. We need to understand the impact, both in terms of personnel and in terms of cost, so that we can respond appropriately and maintain a strong partnership between state government and cities and towns that are required to execute the dictates of Beacon Hill.
Is there any possibility that these changes could occur by November?
Well, in terms of changes relative to funding, I doubt.
Funding,
yeah, I doubt that we're going to see that, but I do think on the heels of the election, we probably will see that. Now, here's the interesting thing. If we go on the path right now that we're on, and I think we will stay on this path, the legislature will probably debate a budget for the remainder of fiscal year 21 sometime in October. And so in October, we'll be finalizing a budget, and yet the election will take place in November. And so what might happen, and I'm only speculating here, so please take it as that, is that we may set up a reserve fund to put dollars aside to say that when we know the amount of these costs, then we'll respond to them and we'll put dollars aside to do that. That's one way that we might try to address it. We might try to predict, based on the experience that we've had up until the time we're debating the budget, what the costs might be. But I do think there is broad support in the legislature and the administration to be able to respond to these extraordinary and new costs that municipalities have not had to deal with in the past.
Well, anything else you want to catch us up with this week?
Well, I think voting is an important topic. One other thing, if I could just point to this, and we talked about some environmental issues in our last conversation, I would just point out that this week, in fact, yesterday, the Trustees of Reservations released their State of the Coast report, which I would recommend for everyone to read. It's on their website, and it really talks about the effect of climate change and the effect of erosion on coastal communities, and highlights some issues without giving directives about what to do about those issues, but highlights some issues and highlights some ways that communities have begun to deal with the issues of coastal resiliency. And I was pleased to be part of that press conference. And of course, as we've talked about, I chair both the Merrimack River Beach Alliance and the Northeast Coastal Coalition, two organizations that are very concerned in our part of the state with dealing with those issues. And it was great yesterday to be able to welcome the Trustees of Reservations to that conversation, because their report provides us with a lot of good information. And I wanted to give a big shout out to them for doing that work and energizing the conversation, even as we deal with other things like, public health and the reopening of schools. One thing that has been with us and is going to be with us are issues of resiliency and adaptation. And their report was a great contributor to the work that's being done on those lines.
I actually saw that article. I saw that you were there that day. And in the article, what was really interesting was the fact that they identified very specific situations in a number of towns that, by 2050, the Great Marsh could basically be gone, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And, one of the interesting things about that, and you're going to think that I perhaps wear too many hats, but I also chair the Great Marsh Revitalization Task Force. And one of the things in that role that I've learned so much about is the natural defense that our marshlands provide in terms of attenuating wave energy in a storm and detaining water that would otherwise be causing flooding more upland. And so we have to be good stewards of these resources, not just because they're great natural resources and they create great habitat for things like spawning that impacts the fishing industry, but also because we have learned, particularly since Hurricane Sandy in our country, about the value of natural defenses in addition to man-made defenses. And I think there's been an awakening. And in the Great Marsh, which extends from Cape Ann northward toward New Hampshire, we've learned a lot about the ability to help the marsh try to adjust to be more resilient. And so one of the things that I talked about yesterday at the press conference was an experiment that's being researched on the marshes of the North Shore to think about whether or not we can use dredge sediment to place it on the marsh in thin levels and allow the marsh to grow through those thin layers and be able to rise to try to get ahead of sea level rise. That's something that's being innovated right in our backyard. And so I think we think now about the marshes in a different way, and that way is in terms of coastal defense, as well as all the other virtues that we've always thought about historically.
So, Corey, the rising sea levels are just one of the things left unchanged by this global pandemic. And in this conversation, I was almost feeling nostalgic for, that's what we used to worry about, rising sea levels. But it is still a really important conversation.
Well, that was a great job, and we want to thank Senator Tarr once again. We'll talk with him again this week for you all. Join us tomorrow. We're speaking with Manchester by the Sea Town Administrator Greg Federspiel.